In the summer of 1950, my father was getting ready for his annual trip back to the U.S. to raise money for the college he worked for in India, the Agricultural Institute of Allahabad, in the north central plains of India, on the Jamna River, where the Ganges River comes in to the Jamna. It's where we lived in the cooler months, all of us. When the weather was hot on the plains, Dad stayed there. The rest of us would be up in the mountains, up in the Tiri Hills, as they were called, the foothills of the Himalayas. So this year, 1950, he was getting ready for his trip to the States, but it was going to be a different trip because my mother was going along with him. And since she was, I also would have to go along because I was just a year old at that point. I was number 4 of the children in our family. There'd been Bill and Ted 2 years apart. Then 4 years later had come Anne. So Mom and Dad had the complete set, 2 boys, 1 girl. No need to add any more. But then 6 years later, they had a surprise. Little Dickie, me, in 1949. And that changed a number of things. It meant that it wouldn't just be the 2 of them going back to the States. The other 3 children were up in boarding school up in the hills where Bill and Ted and I had been born. Anne had been born during the war back in the States. She was 7 when they were planning all this. I was a year and 4 months old when we were about to leave. Now, my popping into existence had changed a fair number of things. Not just the structure of the family, but I'm convinced now, looking back, it changed the mood of our mother. I'm pretty sure she had postpartum depression during that year since I'd been born. She'd been very low, and it was confused and complicated by an infatuation she had with another man who was at the Institute that year, a young man, a seminarian. I think she was convinced she was in love with him. Maybe she was. Possibly they had an affair, although that seems unlikely. But she was very unhappy. Meantime, Dad wrote her letters from Allahabad. She replied from up in the hills, and she began one letter to him. Dear Art, one more of those rainy days when I feel as if I'd like to stay in bed all day and never get out. We've had more early rain than usual this year. And whether they had more rain that year or not, I'm sure it seemed that way to her. She was depressed. She needed a change. She didn't know what to do. She'd had these 4 children. In principle, she loved children. She liked to teach kindergarten classes. She had ambitions of starting a kindergarten herself and leading it. But the fact was, she was low on a nurturing kind of maternal instinct that a close, loving mother and wife has to have. So it was good that the other 3 children were up in the hills in boarding school. They were taken care of. They had pals there. My brothers were very happy in the boarding school. My sister wasn't that first year she went, but I think she got habituated to it and came to like it the way they did. My mother wrote something else in one of her letters that I think was very indicative of her deep malaise. This was a letter to my father's parents, funny enough, because she wasn't particularly close to either of them. And it surprised me to come across this note that she had written to them and the confidence she was imparting, even though they didn't know to read between the lines at that point, the way I do now. In her closing paragraph, she says, "I haven't been a very good letter writer lately, but since I can't seem to find much cheerful to write about, I think it's better not to write anything. I guess India has got me down. I'm surely looking forward to the trip home and only wish that all the children were coming too and that would be staying longer." And I think by that she meant that we'd be staying for keeps back in the States rather than continuing as missionaries in India, where life could be very hard for someone who wasn't used to the terrible heat continually, the terrible dust, the terrible poverty, and the cross-cultural misunderstandings that were inevitable for a foreigner living there. They were betwixt and between, these missionaries. They came to live in a world where they were most comfortable with each other and somehow couldn't quite fit in India, many of them, or to fit in America either. It was an odd, in-between kind of cultural life, understood only by people who live abroad a great deal and aren't tourists, but aren't natives to the places they're living either. As time for our departure approached, Dad started shifting his plan somewhat. In a letter he wrote to my mother in early July, writing uphill from the plains, he said, "A letter has just come asking if I will speak to an all-Chicago meeting of the Presbyterian laymen on September 10th. My tentative schedule would have put us in New York September 14th, so I think I shall push it up 5 days, thus leaving Delhi about August 24th. Are you amenable to the idea?" He knew she was amenable to the idea of leaving early. He knew she would be very pleased to be leaving a week earlier than they had planned. Her only question in response to that was if the three of us were on a flight that stopped in Cairo on the way, as these TWA flights tended to do, would we all have to get yellow fever shot for being in Egypt for a couple of days? Turned out Dad had had a yellow fever shot. He didn't need one, but Mom and I presumably would. And the upshot was we did not stay in Cairo, didn't visit the pyramids, didn't visit the bazaar, but we did have time to walk around for maybe an hour while they refueled the plane and changed the crew and brought fresh meals on board. It was time enough for me as a baby to calm down from my weeping and wailing as we had descended into the Cairo airport and the altitude had hurt my little ears. Also time enough, once we sat down at a restaurant garden, for a little Egyptian bumblebee to come along and find me, alight on my nose and sting it, sending me off into fresh gales of despair. Now my mother, after she had calmed me down for the second time in the hour, had time to write a postcard to my sister in boarding school. A postcard which, if events had turned out a little differently, might have proven to be quite a poignant bit of correspondence. Miss Ann Mosier, Woodstock School, Landour, Mussoorie, UP, India. No salutation. No, my loving sweetie, or anything like that. Mom was not a great one for endearments. Our big plane is like this. It is just like riding in a very smooth American train. Sometime we must plan for the whole family to take a plane trip together. As it happens, we never did, all 6 of us. Dick is the only baby in the plane. There's only one other woman besides me. She's Chinese. I'm writing this at the Cairo, Egypt airport, sitting at a table outdoors near a fountain in a little garden. Love, Mom. She mailed it. It has an Egyptian stamp. Then we got back on the plane and headed for Rome. Dad worked out a schedule after he had moved up our departure by most of a week, where after this long odyssey of flights, exhausted, we got off in Geneva and visited my parents' friends, the McCorkles. Roy McCorkle was a young guy who had gone out to India in 1932, the same time Dad did. They were great friends. Mom and Roy's wife, Betty McCorkle, were also good friends. So that was a nice, secure place for us to visit. She could show off her new baby, and then we'd go on indirectly to New York. This is a very interesting passport that Mom had in those days, number 129. So it was the 129th one granted at the embassy in New Delhi in a certain time frame. And it was intended to be the passport for Mom and all four of us kids. There I am with an X on my face, because at some point in 1952, I think, I got excluded from this passport, probably to get my own passport, because she was in the States by then, having embarked on a serious, heavy course of psychoanalysis, real analysis, with a Freudian analyst outside Princeton, New Jersey, a woman, but an analyst. And that brought the rest of us home from India in 1952, when her crisis actually reached such a point that she could no longer stay in India. But even once we were established back in the States, life in the same house with our mother was hardly a picnic. There aren't many precise, awful moments I recall clearly, but I have a distinct sense of the feel of that little house on Harriet Drive in Princeton, New Jersey. The years I was in kindergarten, it was as if we were walking on eggshells, my sister Ann and I, always afraid some small kind of detonator would set off Mom's rage. My brothers were back in India, still in boarding school. Dad found himself a job where he was traveling a great deal in South America. And so our family unit at that point was just my mother, my sister, and me. And it was not a happy place. It was a place where one had to be wary and watchful about what one said, even as a 4-year-old. But back in 1950, when she and Dad and I were making our way from airport to airport across Europe, she was excited to be going back to the States. Dad was happy to have her with him. And I was just a 16-month-old toddler. I could say what a 16-month-old could say. I could issue opinions, but they were not filled with existential angst like my mother's thoughts at the time. So we stayed with our friends the McCorkles in Switzerland for a week, and then it was time to go back to the Geneva airport and catch our flight to Paris, which, as it happened, would pick up the itinerary exactly where it would have been originally before Dad had changed the plan to get us to America a week earlier. We were going to get onto the same plane with the same seatmates we would have had coming from Rome on the first plan. Decades later, Mom told me about how she and Dad had stood there waiting for the flight to arrive. They were expecting the plane would be full of a fair number of Indians from Bombay, quite a few Egyptians, number of American businessmen probably. Well, the flight was late arriving from Rome. And then it was later arriving. Dad explained that that wasn't unusual in these international flights. He was starting to get accustomed to flying instead of taking ships because he'd had to make these frequent trips back to the States for his speechifying to raise money for the Institute. And the point came where TWA fed us a meal there at the airport. 6, 7, 8 hours had gone by. My parents were starting to wonder if TWA was going to have to put us up overnight, and they weren't happy about this prospect. Dad was trying to figure how he would scramble his plans to make up for this delay, when finally, after about a 10-hour delay, they said, "Your plane is here now. We're ready for boarding." We walked up the staircase, the wheeled staircase, and climbed aboard, expecting the flight to be full of Indians and Egyptians, but were surprised to find that it was almost empty. There were a few people speaking Italian. They couldn't quite figure it out, but they were so tired that we got to our seats and pretty well collapsed and got ready for the next phase of our trip. It wasn't a very long flight from Geneva to Paris, and when we got off at the Paris airport, it was Le Bourget where we landed, the same airport where Lindbergh had landed many years earlier. We got into the terminal, and my parents at a newsstand saw a headline on an English-speaking newspaper. I don't know if it would have been the Herald Tribune, International Herald Tribune in those days, about a plane crash near Cairo. And it was our plane. The plane we had been scheduled to be passengers aboard. The number 3 engine had caught fire. I don't know if they knew about this in the newspaper this soon, but that's what had happened. Not long after takeoff, the plane had gone about 65 or 70 miles and banked around. It was seen by many people. It was at night. There were a number of witnesses who said it turned as if trying to make its way back to Cairo, to the airport. It seemed to be at about 10,000 feet. And then there was this fiery comet that came down from one wing. It was the engine that was on fire somehow loosened itself from the frame of the plane, was full of fuel lumbering along. And the pilot tried to land it in the desert. It was on the edge of the western desert, they said. The plane came down level, and then it tore up some railroad tracks where it landed. It went flying along, it burst into flame, and everything was incinerated in this long cone of fire. And they later on were able to determine the exact moment of impact because they found people's watches in the debris. And their watches had all stopped at 3 minutes past the hour. One account said that the plane took off at 11:35 p.m. 7 crew members, 48 passengers, 1 Egyptian film star, 23 Americans, mostly businessmen. When Dad flew, he was usually one man of many on board the plane. My parents determined later that plane, which had a name, it was called the Star of Maryland. That plane was the very plane we had been on flying from Bombay to Cairo, and then from Cairo to Rome, and Rome to Geneva. Because it was one plane that kept making the trip back and forth from Bombay to New York and points in between. The crew would change, but the plane would stay the same. It would be serviced now and then. So we had been on that plane. Whatever part of engine number 3 that was about to give way and overheat and cause this aviation disaster was probably weakening when we were on board, too. There's no way of knowing any of that. But none of that was important to me as a 1-year-old. I was a bubbly little boy. What mattered to me was my ears hurting when I was on this big plane that would take off and then land. That mattered. And when that bee stung my nose, that hurt a lot, and that mattered to me. But then I forgot it after I stopped weeping and carrying on. How could my parents forget what had happened to those people sitting in our places on that plane? How could they not think about us sitting there when that had happened? You try not to dwell on such things, especially when you have a young child with you. A young child may not understand the complexities of adult life, but even a little boy, 16 months old, can sense fear and misery. I'm guessing that even I, during that period, could tell when my mother was very, very unhappy. And that was a lot at the time. She didn't blame me. She never said to me that I recall, and I don't think she ever did say, if you hadn't been born, none of this would have happened to me. That might have been true, but I don't know that she would have been aware of that in those days. And she wouldn't have said such a thing. She might not have been deeply nurturing and loving as a person, but it wasn't her fault. It was that she was missing a kind of gene, almost, an emotional gene. She was missing something, a kind of personal warmth that would open someone's heart for the people she loved. My mother never said she loved any of us, unless we said it first and forced the issue. Later on, when I was a child in Ithaca, when I was 8 or 10 years old, I remember when they were in the kitchen of our house in Ithaca, some music was playing on our transistor radio. We had a little orange transistor radio. There was a tune Dad must have liked, and he took hold of her and he said, "Come on, beautiful, let's dance." And she froze in his arms. She couldn't dance with him. All he wanted was to dance a few steps around the kitchen with his wife. It's so sad, life, sometimes. And yet, how much sadder must it have been for the families of those people who died in that Egyptian desert that night. So we made our way, a few days in Paris, a few days in London, on across the Atlantic to New York City, and then Dad made it in time to Chicago to speak to this conclave of the, what were they called? The All Chicago Presbyterian Laymen. That's the kind of group he would talk to. And he would charm them. He would tell them why he was in India. He would make it important to them, too. The idea that Indians would learn how to farm more efficiently and to feed themselves better on their own, so no one had to give them any sort of charity. He was very good at talking about those things. If only he'd gotten his wife to dance with him, too. Then that side of his life could have been more complete as well.